What does Christmas really mean?
That's a good question. Why don't we try to find out together, Patty? But first, let's introduce ourselves.
I am Mike Derry-News-Key.
And I am Patty Duke.
You're about 16, aren't you, Patty? What better way is there to make Christmas come alive than by telling Christmas stories?
And the kind of stories that can perhaps tell us what Christmas really means. It's not a nice thing to steal on Christmas Day. But to steal from a church, how could anyone stoop so low? On this particular Christmas morning, the church sexton, pale and agitated, rushed to the pastor and gasped, "The child, the Christ child, has gone from the manger crib in the sanctuary." "That's ridiculous," replied the pastor. But it was true. The beloved little statuette of the infant was gone from the shrine. The thoughts of the kindly clergyman were in turmoil. What kind of fiend would commit such an outrage? Was it someone who wished to defile the symbol of the very birth of Christianity? Did someone want revenge on the church, the pastor, the congregation, or upon God? "Shall we call the police?" the sexton asked. The pastor shook his head. He glanced about the church he loved. Only 8 hours before, it had been filled with a happy but reverent throng attending the midnight service. Soon, the church would be filled with people for the Christmas morning service. What would their stunned reaction be when they found the Christ child missing? Deeply disturbed, the pastor put on his hat and coat and wandered outside. To passers-by, he murmured a Merry Christmas he did not feel. As he reached the corner, a small boy pulling a red express wagon almost knocked him down. "Georgie Potter!" The pastor started to rebuke the boy. But the shining light on the ruddy little 7-year-old face stopped him. He smiled. "Now is that a new wagon I see?" "Yes, sir," the boy said, bursting with joy. Suddenly the clergyman stiffened. There was the missing Christ child. The pastor stared transfixed. The statuette of the infant Jesus, with its baby arms outstretched in wide benediction, lay in the wagon with a blanket tucked about it. The shining light was gone from the boy's face, and he cowered. "Georgie, did you take that from the church?" "But I promised," the boy blurted out. "I prayed and prayed for a red wagon, and I promised the Christ child if he'd get me a red wagon for Christmas, I'd give him a ride in it twice round the block, and I've only been around once." The pastor's face softened in a loving smile. Before they took the statuette back to the church, he helped the boy wheel the Christ child a second time around the block. I think it would be a great thing for every family to see how simple they can make Christmas. For it's possible to remember friends and show our love to our family without spending a lot of money, like the Fred Baileys. It all began during the Big Depression back in the 30s. Right before Christmas, a bank failure had suddenly and cruelly wiped out all the Bailey savings. A few days later, Mr. Bailey lost his job. With a wife and young daughter at home, he dreaded the approaching holiday. All he had to his name was $1. Nonetheless, on Christmas Eve, Mr. Bailey and his wife went shopping. At the 10-cent store, they carefully selected a doll. Then they went to the butcher shop and bought the only meat they could afford. In the morning, the Bailey living room was filled with multicolored paper chains and cut-out figures. An evergreen tree was bedecked with gay colors and love, too. It came from the front lawn. The doll lay beneath the tree, and beside it was a pretty wardrobe made from scraps of ribbon and cloth. From the delightful squeals of joy from the little girl who rushed downstairs that morning, this was the most exciting of all fairylands. Dinner time came. The family thanked God for their many blessings, and then, from the kitchen, Mrs. Bailey brought the big meat course. And what a course! She had taken a package of hot dogs and transformed each one into an animal with a personality of its own. There were toothpicks for legs and broom straws for tails and whiskers. The little girl laughed with a merriment that spread around the table, leaving a glow destined to last not only through the day, but down through the years. Today, Mr. Bailey still buys hot dogs for Christmas, to remind me that the more simple we keep life, the easier it is to feel closer to God. The late Fulton Oursler wrote a story called A String of Blue Beads that has become a little classic. I'd like to tell it just as he wrote it. Pete Richards was the loneliest man in town on the day Jean Grace opened the door to his shop. The little front window was filled with a disarray of old-fashioned things, bracelets and lockets, gold rings and silver boxes, images of jade and ivory, porcelain figurines. On this winter's afternoon, a child was standing there, her forehead against the glass, earnest and enormous eyes studying each discarded treasure as if she were looking for something quite special. Finally, she straightened up with a satisfied air and entered the store. Behind the counter stood Pete, a man not more than 30, but with hair already turning gray. There was a bleak air about him as he studied the small customer who flattened her hands on the counter. "Mister," she began, "would you please let me look at the string of blue beads in the window?" Pete parted the drapes and lifted out a necklace. The turquoise stones gleamed brightly against the pallor of his palm as he spread the ornament before her. "They're just perfect," said the girl, entirely to herself. "Will you wrap them up pretty for me, please?" Pete studied her with a stony air. "Are you buying these for someone?" he asked. "They're for my big sister," the girl said. "She takes care of me. You see, this will be the first Christmas since Mother died. I've been looking for the most wonderful Christmas present for my sister." She had been busily untying the knots in a handkerchief, and now she poured out a handful of pennies on the counter. "I emptied my bank," she explained simply. Pete Richards looked at her thoughtfully. Then he carefully drew back the necklace. The price tag was visible to him, but not to her. How could he tell her? The trusting look of her blue eyes smote him like the pain of an old wound. "Just a minute," he said, and turned toward the back of the store. Over his shoulder he called, "What's your name?" He was very busy about something. "Jean Grace." When Pete returned to where Jean Grace waited, a package lay in his hand, wrapped in scarlet paper and with a bow of green ribbon. "There you are," he said shortly. "Don't lose it on the way home." She smiled happily at him over her shoulder as she ran out the door. Through the window he watched her go, while desolation flooded his thoughts. Something about Jean Grace and her string of beads had stirred him to the depths of a grief that would not stay buried. The child's hair was wheat yellow, her eyes sea blue. Once upon a time, not long before, Pete had been in love with a girl with hair of that same yellow and with eyes just as blue, and the turquoise necklace was to have been hers. But there had come a rainy night, a truck skidding on a slippery road, and the life was crushed out of his dreams. Since then, Pete Richards had lived too much with his grief in solitude. The blue eyes of Jean Grace jolted him into sharp remembrance of what had happened. The pain of it made him recoil from the exuberance of holiday shoppers. When the last customer had gone, late on Christmas Eve, he sighed with relief. It was over for another year. But for Pete Richards, the night was not quite over. The door opened, and a young woman hurried in. With a start, he realized that she looked familiar, yet he could not remember when or where he had seen her before. Her hair was golden yellow, and her large eyes were blue. Without speaking, she drew from her purse a package loosely unwrapped in its red paper, and a bow of green ribbon with it. Presently, the string of blue beads lay gleaming again before him. "Did this come from your shop?" she said. Pete raised his eyes to hers and answered softly, "Yes, it did." "Are the stones real?" "Not the finest quality, but real," Pete said. "Can you remember who it was you sold them to?" the girl asked. A small girl. Her name was Jean. She bought them for her older sister's Christmas present. Are they worth much? She asked. The price, he told her solemnly, is always a confidential matter between the seller and the customer. But Jean has never had more than a few pennies of spending money. How could she pay for them? Pete was folding the gay paper back into its creases, rewrapping the little package just as neatly as before. She paid the biggest price anyone can ever pay, he said. She gave all she had. There was a silence that filled the little curio shop. In some faraway steeple, a bell began to ring. At the sound of the distant chiming, the little package lying on the counter, the question in the eyes of the girl, and the strange feeling of renewal struggling unreasonably in the heart of the man, all had come to be because of the love of a child. But why did you do it? The girl asked. He held out the gift in his hand. It's already Christmas morning, he said, and it's my misfortune that I have no one to give anything to. Will you let me see you home and wish you a Merry Christmas at your door? And so, to the sound of many bells, and in the midst of happy people, Pete Richards and a girl whose name he had yet to learn walked out into the beginning of the great day that brings hope into the world for us all. There's a poem called Toys for a King, which speaks to me in a memorable way on what and how to give to the Christ child. What gifts do please a little boy who has the whole world for his toy? Through him, with him, and in him live the lovely playthings I would give. Black branches traced on afterglow, blue moonlight on the wind-glazed snow, music and singing words, but these were always his. Upon my knees I cannot ask a king to take the stars he watched his father make. Here, on the clean straw of his throne, I lay the only things I own. A battered will, a raveled mind, a broken dream I cannot wind. If I had come to him before and laid them on the stable floor, not scratched and finger-marked with sin, how new and gay they would have been. Yet, strange things catch a baby's eyes. There, in his hand, my frayed heart lies.
My name is Norman Vincent Peale.
And my name is Patty Duke. We are here to share with you Christmas stories and verse from Guideposts, a magazine read by millions of people of all religions and from all walks of life.
And we hope that these special holiday stories will help you find a richer and perhaps even a new meaning in Christmas. There's no greater joy than lifting a load from someone's heart.
And when we do, we usually lift a load from our own. This is the story of two small brothers who had between them the secret of happiness, and a young man named Paul Fuller who learned it from them. Paul, a salesman, was not much on giving, but he knew how to take. One year, just before Christmas, Paul's older brother gave him a new automobile. On Christmas Eve, Paul came out of his office and saw a street urchin walking around the shiny new car, admiring it. "Is this your car, mister?" the boy asked. Paul nodded. "My brother gave it to me for Christmas." The boy looked astounded. "You mean your brother gave it to you, and it didn't cost you nothing? Gosh, I wish..." He hesitated, and Paul knew what he was going to wish. He was going to wish he had a brother like that. But what the boy said jarred Paul all the way down to his heels. "I wish," the boy went on, "that I could be a brother like that." Paul looked at the boy in astonishment. Then, impulsively, he said, "Would you like to ride in my automobile?" "Oh, yes," the boy replied quickly. "I'd love that." They hardly started the ride when the urchin turned, with his eyes aglow, and said, "Mister, would you mind driving in front of my house?" Paul smiled a little. He thought he knew what the boy wanted. He wanted to show his neighbors that he could ride home in a big new automobile. But Paul was wrong again. "Will you stop right where those steps are?" the boy asked. He ran up the steps. Then, in a little while, Paul heard him coming back. But he was not coming fast. He was carrying his little brother. The smaller boy held a crutch. He was crippled by polio. The big brother sat him down on the bottom step, then sort of squeezed up against him and pointed to the car. "There she is, buddy, just like I told you. The man's brother gave it to him for Christmas, and it didn't cost him a cent. Someday I'm going to give you one just like it. Then you can see for yourself all the pretty things in Christmas windows I've been trying to tell you about." Paul got out and lifted the smaller boy and his crutch to the front seat of his car. The older brother, his eyes shining, climbed in beside him, and the three of them began an unforgettable holiday ride. And for the first time that Christmas Eve, Paul learned what Jesus meant when he said, "It is more blessed to give." I read in Guideposts some words by Henry Van Dyke that could almost be a part of a Christmas church service.
Let's read them together now.
Are you willing to forget what you have done for other people and remember what other people have done for you?
Are you willing to ignore what the world owes you and think what you owe the world?
Are you willing to see that your fellow men are just as real as you are and try to look behind their faces and into their hearts, hungry for the same joy you want?
Are you willing to close your book of complaints against the management of the universe and look around for a place where you can sow a few seeds of happiness? Are you willing to do these things even for a day? Then you can keep Christmas.
Are you willing to stoop down and consider the needs of little children, to remember the weakness and loneliness of people who are growing old?
Are you willing to stop asking how much your friends love you and ask yourself whether you love them enough?
Are you willing to trim your lamp so that it will give more light and less smoke, and to carry it in front so that your shadow will fall behind you?
Are you willing to believe that love is the strongest thing in the world, stronger than hate, stronger than evil, stronger than death, and that the blessed life which began in Bethlehem 1900 years ago is the image and brightness of the eternal love? Then you can keep Christmas.
And if you keep it for a day, why not always?
But remember, you can never keep it alone.
Dr. Peale, do you remember the Guidepost story by Arthur Gordon about the unbeliever, the stubborn unbeliever?
Yes, about the man with gifted hands who could see but was blind. Tell it, Patty.
The man's name was Luigi, and the story took place over 700 years ago in the village of Greccio, Italy. Luigi was a strong man, black-eyed, hot-tempered, with wonderful, sensitive hands. From childhood, he had had the gift of shaping wood into marvelous imitations of life, and for a long time he accepted this talent with gratitude as a sign of God's favor. But the day came when Luigi cursed heaven. It was the day that he learned his daughter, his only child, had been born blind. After that, Luigi went no more to the little church on the hill. He refused to allow prayers in his house. His wife pleaded in vain. Nothing could move him. "I will have nothing to do," he said, "with a God who condemns innocent children to darkness." And he went off to finish carving a magnificent piece of ivory into a doll, a bambino, for his little girl. Life-sized, smiling, the ivory bambino seemed almost to breathe. Meanwhile, in the village, everyone was talking about the young friar who had come from a neighboring town to preach. Whoever heard him came away with an unusual sense of peace, as if all the anger and pain of living had been lifted from their hearts. Luigi's wife heard the young friar preach, and she begged her husband to come to church with her. But Luigi shook his head. "When this God of yours shows me that he can cure blindness, then I will believe in him." On Christmas Eve, when by chance Luigi went into his workshop, his shout of fury brought the servants running. The ivory bambino was gone. From a terrified maid, Luigi learned that his wife had taken the ivory image to the church to have it blessed. Out into the street and up the hill stalked Luigi, black anger in his heart. Before he could reach the church door, a cavalcade swept up. 3 young nobles, richly dressed, then 6 mounted servants, and finally 2 carts loaded with animals, sheep, goats, oxen, a donkey. A young man in a purple coat sprang down from his horse. "Francesco Bernardoni," he shouted. "We got your message, and we are here." Luigi asked one of the servants, "Who is this Francesco Bernardoni that you seek here in Greccio?" The servant pointed. "That is he, the friar." The church door had opened, and a slender, brown-clad figure had come out. "Welcome, my friends," he said, smiling, "and God's peace be upon you." Luigi tightened his hold on the servant's shoulder. "Who is this man?" The servant shrugged despairingly. "In Assisi, until not long ago, he was my master's friend and drinking companion. Now they say he preaches the word of God. It is very strange." A hush seemed to fall upon the people who had gathered. In this sudden quiet, the friar said to the young man in the purple cloak, "Come into the church, Lorenzo. I want to show you my manger scene." The young man hesitated. "I am no believer, Francesco. All the more reason for coming," the little friar said. He turned back into the church, and all the animals followed him, and the people too. Even Luigi followed, because he could not help it. Inside, near the altar, was a shelter made of green boughs, and in the shelter was a manger. Luigi knew what it contained, for a woman was kneeling near it, her face beautiful in the candlelight. The woman was his wife. Without being led, without being driven, the animals gathered around the manger. Then the little friar stood before them. "I was going to read you the Christmas story from the Gospel," he said, "but my nativity scene makes me so happy that I am going to sing it to you." No one who heard this song ever forgot its sweetness. Even the animals seemed to be listening, and Luigi was prepared to believe that they could understand the words too, because an even greater miracle was taking place within himself. His anger seemed to be fading away. A strange peace had come upon him. Luigi felt a touch on his arm. Looking around, he saw the little friar smiling at him. "You wondered if God could cure blindness," the friar said. "Well, we are watching him do it, are we not?" Luigi did not answer, for there was a tightness in his throat. Then the friar said, "Please thank your daughter for the loan of her Christmas present, and now you may take it back." Luigi shook his head. "It is where it belongs. Let it stay." The friar said, "Tomorrow it is Christmas. Your daughter will be disappointed." "No," said Luigi. "I will make her another bambino." So Luigi went home, leaving behind the ivory bambino with St. Francis of Assisi in what, according to legend, was the first actual creche. Hand in hand with his wife, he walked back down the hill, and he worked all night with gratitude in his heart, because he knew that in his house blindness had indeed been cured, not his daughter's, but his own. A missionary once told this story to show that the way you give a gift is more important than the gift itself. It seems that a young African had been taught by a missionary that Christ's birthday was a time for giving of oneself. On Christmas morning, he brought the missionary a seashell of lustrous beauty. The teacher asked the African where he had found such an extraordinary shell. The young man explained that he had walked to a bay where only such shells were to be found. The bay was many miles away. "I think it was wonderful of you to travel so far to get this lovely gift for me," the missionary exclaimed. The young man's eyes brightened, and he said, "Long walk, part of gift."
Patty and I have been relating guidepost stories that are joyous and touching and beautiful.
Actress Patty Duke knows how holidays can tear a family apart. Now she reaches out to others who know that pain.
Holidays in my family as a child were the usual expectations of, Santa Claus and perfect Christmas. We were in agony.